And my Strad was owned by one of my heroes, Bronislaw Huberman, one of the great violinists at the beginning of the 20th century. And it has even more intrigue because it was stolen from him at Carnegie Hall, where he was playing a concert, and someone snuck in and took it, and it was never recovered during his lifetime. It only reappeared in the 80s when the thief who had kept it for 50 years and played on it for 50 years, he sort of admitted on his deathbed that he had stolen the instrument. And so it's sort of kind of right out of the Red Violin movie, and on top of it, my violin, the Huberman Strad, is particularly reddish, and there are only a few Strads that have this particularly red varnish. And so it was like, when I found it, it was like I fell in love with it, and I thought, this is my red violin. I played the soundtrack for a film called The Red Violin, which then won the Oscar for John Corigliano, the composer. I read the script, and it was basically told these stories, one by one, each of the owners of the violin, and followed them. I got to play various characters. Every time you hear that red violin, that was my playing, so that was fun. Just a couple years later, I stumbled upon the Strad that I have now. Antonio Stradivari is the iconic name in violin making. His instruments were groundbreaking. He developed a way of making instruments that had the most beautifully balanced and beautiful sound I think of any instruments ever. Most people who know nothing about violins or classical know that Stradivarius is like, they know it like Picasso or Rembrandt or something like as that great name. And so I got my first Stradivarius when I was 19 years old. And it was not one of the famous, really expensive ones. And I managed to mortgage my next several years away to buy it. But because of that, I was able then to trade that in my 20s for a fantastic Strad. And then years later, in 2001, I came across the Huberman Strad from 1713. Probably the most valuable ones are from this sort of 20-year period in his life. But it really not until the 19th century that some of the names start popping up. A man named Gibson, who was a violinist at the time, it took on his name for a while, and then Huberman owned it, and now I call it the Huberman Strad. Huberman was in Carnegie Hall, the greatest hall in America at the time, maybe still. He was playing a recital, but he had two violins. He had a Guarneri and a Strad, and he would play both of them in different pieces. And during the second half of the concert, he played on the Guarneri, and he left the Strad backstage in his dressing room. And he finished playing the last note, and his assistant had noticed that his violin was gone from his dressing room. And of course, that's panicked. Someone had taken the Stradivarius, and the word was out to the police, and it was in the papers, and it was a big deal, a heist of a violin like this. And usually, when violins are stolen, they turn up because it's very hard to sell an instrument like that because it will immediately be known. It's like selling the Mona Lisa. So it never turned up, and he lived another 11 or 12 years after that, never saw the violin again. It was a big mystery for 50 years. And then in the 80s, 1986, almost 50 years after it was stolen, we find out that the thief was not interested in selling the violin. The thief was a violinist and wanted to have a Stradivarius to play on. And he was probably around 20 years old, that he had snuck into Carnegie Hall that night and managed to convince the backstage crew that he was a huge fan of Huberman's, which for sure he was, and said, can I just stand in the wings and listen? And he snuck into the dressing room and put it underneath his coat and went out, and he proceeded to play on it himself. And he had a career as a violinist. And it's even been said that people would ask him, what's that violin? And he would even joke, this is a Stradivarius. And the other issue when you have a violin is that you need to take it in to get looked at. And if you were to take it to any expert, they'd say, what are you doing with this Strad? And they might even say, oh my God, this is the Huberman Strad, and call the police. He covered it up with a kind of shoe polish to make it look kind of black and grimy, so that nobody would ever know. And it turns out that this man, Julian Altman, violinist, probably not a great violinist, would have never been able to get a Strad on his own in the right legal way, had taken this violin and had a career playing on Huberman Strad, and then finally on his deathbed, Julian Altman confessed to his wife, and tucked in the violin case in some secret compartment were articles about the stolen Huberman violin, and he said, "Go look at these articles. You'll see that this is the violin that I've been playing on." So he confessed, and it was then, and then he died soon after. Charles Beer, who ended up selling it to me many years later, was given the violin to sort of restore, because Julian Altman had put this shoe polish on it. So they spent 9 months cleaning meticulously this violin. Underneath all this grime was revealed this very rich original varnish of Strad that was still preserved, and it was an amazing sight, and actually they were left with a violin that was extremely valuable and one of the best Strads around, that was still in good condition. So when I tried the violin in London, I was playing a concert at the Royal Albert Hall that night, and I went in to get some strings at the famous violin shop, Charles Beer, and they said, "Before you leave, we just happen to have in just today, it's on its way to Germany, but we have the famous stolen Huberman Strad." And I said, "Oh, let me try it." And I went in a room and I literally started shaking when I played a few notes, because I thought, this is my violin. It's an amazing chemistry that one has with their instrument. And it's an amazing thing when you play a note on it and you feel the overtones, the ringing. But it's also a piece of history. It's also a beautiful work of art. It's so many things. Then there are moments, where I connect on stage in front of an audience. You're playing great music, a Beethoven concerto, which is also one of the greatest human achievements, along with one of the greatest instruments ever made by a human being. These things put together, you just feel elevated and incredibly privileged. So I feel incredibly lucky to get to work with it every day. Sometimes I pinch myself.
That was
Okay.
beautiful. What's the name of that piece?
That's Wieniawski. That's what I'm playing on this tour. Wieniawski Violin Concerto.
Okay.